Long before the Hopi built their villages on the high mesas of northern Arizona, before Spanish soldiers ever wrote their name into a European record, before anyone drew their land on a map, they were already telling a story about the end of a world, not the end of everything, the end of a world. Because according to the Hopi, the world we live in now is not the first one, it is the fourth, and each of the worlds that came before it ended in catastrophe. The Hopi remembered those endings in detail. And in the story of the third world, the one that came just before our own, there is a moment that has unsettled people for over a century. The Hopi said that before that world was destroyed, something came down out of the sky. Not a storm, not a flood. Beings. Beings who descended, who walked among the people, and who, according to the oldest accounts, chose who would be allowed to survive what was coming. For generations, this was dismissed as myth. Then, in the late 1800s, outsiders finally wrote it down. And what they recorded sounded far stranger than anyone had expected. To understand why this story still matters, we have to go back further than the newspapers, further than the archaeologists, further than the state of Arizona itself, because the Hopi were telling this long before any of that existed. The Hopi are one of the oldest continuously living cultures in North America. Their villages on the mesas have been occupied for centuries. One of them, Oribe, is considered among the oldest continuously inhabited settlements on the continent. These are not a people who arrived recently and invented a past. Their history is measured in a depth of time that most cultures cannot match. And at the center of that history is a belief that humanity has passed through a series of worlds. The Hopi call the present one the fourth world. Before it came a third, and before that a second, and before that a first. Each earlier world was brought to an end, the accounts say, when the people living in it lost their way, when they forgot the instructions they had been given, when corruption spread and the balance of things broke. But here is the part that makes the Hopi tradition different from an ordinary story about sin and punishment. Each time a world ended, the accounts say, the people were not simply wiped out. A few were chosen, a few were guided, a few were kept safe, hidden away, until it was possible to emerge into the next world and begin again. And the question the tradition raises, the question that has never been fully answered, is this: guided by whom? Kept safe by what? Before we go further, if you find yourself drawn to the places where recorded history and older, stranger memory meet, consider subscribing. It genuinely helps this channel keep digging into stories like this one. Because what the Hopi described coming down before the third world ended was not vague. It was specific. And it is the detail that turns this from a simple legend into something much harder to set aside. According to the tradition, the third world was a place of great achievement. The people grew powerful. They built. They spread across the land. But with that power came the same failure that had destroyed the worlds before. They turned on one another. They used what they had built for war. And the world began to slide toward its end. It was then, the accounts say, that beings appeared. In the Hopi tradition, they are remembered under different names and described in different ways, depending on who preserved the account. Some speak of the Kachinas, spirit beings tied to the sky, to rain, to the forces the Hopi depended on to survive. Others speak of the ant people, beings who lived beneath the earth and who had sheltered the ancestors during earlier catastrophes. And in the endings of the worlds, these beings are remembered as doing something very particular. They came to the people who had remained faithful. They came, in some accounts, from above. and they led those chosen few away to safety before the destruction arrived. In the versions that survive, the descriptions are physical. The chosen were gathered. They were taken underground, into chambers, into shelter that already existed before they needed it. They waited there, protected, while the world above them was destroyed. And when it was over, they emerged into the next world through an opening the Hopi call the Sipapu, a real feature in their sacred geography, tied to the landscape of the Grand Canyon itself. So we are left with a description that does not read like ordinary myth. Beings that descend, a selection of who will live and who will not, a withdrawal beneath the earth, a sheltering, and an emergence into a new age, told and retold for centuries by a people who insisted it was not a fable, but their own history. But then comes the obvious question. If this was preserved for so long, why did the outside world know almost nothing about it until barely 100 years ago? For most of Hopi history, these accounts were never written at all. They lived in oral tradition, held by specific clans, carried by elders whose responsibility was to remember them exactly and pass them on. Unlike a written record, which can sit forgotten in an archive, this knowledge survived only by being spoken, generation after generation, without a break. That began to change in the late 19th century. As anthropologists and government surveyors moved into the Southwest, a handful of them began recording Hopi accounts directly from the elders who held them. Their names are part of the real historical record. Researchers working in that period documented Hopi ceremonies, Hopi clan histories, and Hopi accounts of the earlier worlds, and published them. For the first time, the story of the world ages left the mesas and entered the written record of the outside world. And this is where the tradition becomes difficult to dismiss, because these accounts were not collected in one place, from one person, and then copied around. They were recorded from different clans, in different villages, by different outsiders, at different times. And they agreed. The structure of the worlds, the pattern of the endings, the beings who intervened, the sheltering beneath the earth, the emergence, these elements recur across accounts that were gathered independently. When separate sources, preserved separately, describe the same thing, historians take notice. It does not prove the events happened, but it does mean the tradition was old and stable and consistent long before anyone from outside was there to write it down or shape it. Then researchers notice something else, and this is the part that has kept the story alive. The Hopi did not describe their sheltering places as symbols. They tied them to the physical landscape. The Sipapu is placed in the region of the Grand Canyon. The migrations are described as real journeys across real country, and the ruins scattered across the Southwest. The abandoned villages, the cliff dwellings, the great houses of Chaco Canyon sit inside the same landscape the Hopi say their ancestors moved through as the worlds turned over. Mainstream archaeology has its own account of that landscape. It describes ancestral Puebloan peoples, long migrations, settlements built and then abandoned, sometimes suddenly, for reasons that are still debated. Drought, conflict, resource collapse. The archaeological record is real, and it is genuinely unsettled on why some of these places emptied so quickly. And so we arrive at the same uncomfortable overlap that has haunted this subject before. On one side, an oral tradition describing worlds that ended, people who fled underground, and beings who guided them. On the other, a physical landscape full of structures that were built with enormous effort and then abandoned, sometimes for reasons no one has fully explained. None of that proves the Hopi account is literal history. It does not prove beings descended from the sky, but it does mean that a people who lived in this landscape for a very long time preserved a memory of catastrophe and survival, and tied that memory to specific, real places that archaeologists are still trying to understand, which raises the question that will not go away. Could the tradition and the ruins be two different records of the same events? One written in stone and one carried in memory? That question becomes harder to wave away when you look at how carefully the Hopi guarded these accounts. This was never entertainment. The world-age tradition sits at the center of Hopi religious life. It is tied to ceremony, to the ritual calendar, to the roles of specific clans. It carried obligations, it carried warnings, and crucially, it carried a prophecy, a belief that the fourth world, our world, would one day face the same test the others failed. That it too could end if the people forgot their instructions and turned on one another. That is, not the shape of a story invented to explain the weather. It is the shape of a history a people believed they were living inside of. More than a century after these accounts first entered the written record, they have never been fully explained, and they have never quite gone away. Anthropologists continue to study them as one of the richest and best preserved oral traditions on the continent. Many Hopi continue to regard them as sacred and as true. And in the year 2000, the Hopi Cultural Preservation Office made clear that certain places and certain stories tied to this tradition are not meant to be turned into spectacle, but respected. That request matters because it reminds us what we are actually looking at. Not a puzzle to be solved and discarded, but a living memory, still held by the people it belongs to. So what do we do with the beings who came down before the third world ended? We can say what is certain. The Hopi are real and ancient and still here. The tradition of the world ages is real, recorded from multiple clans, consistent across independent sources. The landscape it describes is real, filled with ruins that archaeology still cannot fully explain. And the account of beings who descended, chose the faithful, sheltered them beneath the earth, and led them into the next world. That account is genuinely part of what was preserved. It was not added later. It was there when the outsiders first wrote it down. What we cannot say is what those beings were, whether they were spirits understood through the language of ceremony, whether they were a memory of something the Hopi ancestors genuinely witnessed, preserved across so many centuries that its edges have worn smooth, or whether they belong entirely to the realm of the sacred and were never meant to be measured against the archaeological record at all. History rarely hands us clean answers to questions like this. Sometimes it gives us a tradition on one side and a landscape on the other, and asks us to sit with the fact that they seem to be pointing at each other. The Hopi have never claimed to hold every answer. What they have held, carefully for longer than the state around them has existed, is a memory of worlds that ended, a memory of people who were chosen to survive, and a memory of something that came down from the sky before the third world fell and decided who would live to see the fourth. Whether that memory is myth, history, or something in between is a question each generation has to answer for itself. What cannot be argued is that the Hopi have carried it, unbroken, across centuries, and that the land they carried it across is still, in places, refusing to fully explain itself. So the next time you see the mesas of northern Arizona, or the empty ruins scattered across that country, it is worth remembering that the people who know this landscape best have always said the same thing, that we are not the first, that worlds have ended here before, and that when they did, something came down to decide who would begin again. Thank you for watching. If you're drawn to the places where recorded history runs up against older, stranger memory, consider subscribing. It's what lets this channel keep investigating stories like this one. And before you go, I'd like to hear from you. Do you think the Hopi World Age tradition and the unexplained ruins of the Southwest are completely unconnected? Or could they be two different memories of the same events? Let me know in the comments, and I'll see you in the next one.